All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Linguistic Fieldwork Spotlight. We are lucky to be joined today by Matt Carter and Anthony Struthers-Young, both of whom are graduate students in our department who both do a lot of linguistic fieldwork. So they're going to be presenting their work to us today. So they'll be going one after another, presenting some of their recent research. Each will have about 15 minutes to present, and then 5 minutes left over for any audience questions after each of their talks. So we have Matt Carter with us here today, who specializes in some of the smaller languages of Russia and Siberia. And then Anthony Struthers-Young specializes in musical surrogate languages, so basically languages that encode linguistic content through music. Which is super amazing work for both of them. So Anthony, Matthew, would one of you prefer to go first, or should I flip a coin?
Feel free to flip a coin.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so I've got, all right, heads for Matthew, tails for Anthony. All right, and we've got tails. So Anthony, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just get my screen set up.
Sounds great. And at the end, we will be sharing some resources from Professor Caballero regarding linguistic fieldwork and all of that. So stick around to the end to get some of those resources.
Would you enable screen sharing or co-host me?
Oh, yes. Let's see. Bethany, I believe you're the organizer for this one. Do you mind? Thank you.
Okay, should be good now.
Okay. Should be set up to share audio, but like if there's a video playing and you don't hear anything, let me know. Sorry, let me just get a chat window open so I can make sure to see everything. Okay, cool. So, hi everyone. Thanks again for inviting me. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the research I do on the Tusian languages and specifically musical surrogate languages. So I study a couple of different things. I work with Tusian speakers, both Northern and Southern Tusian. And I work on musical surrogate languages. So this is a way of encoding speech using musical instruments. And I'm also interested in grammatical tone and floating features. I won't really talk about this at all throughout the talk, but if you're interested in either of those or like tone in general, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to chat about it. So the Tusian languages are spoken by the Tusian people in Southwest Burkina Faso. So Burkina Faso is an interior West African country. So to the west, you have Mali. To the south, you have Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and then the east is Niger. So the Tusian languages are here in the kind of southwest region, which is a real hotbed of linguistic diversity. Burkina is about the size of Colorado, but there are 63 different ethnicities in the country, and each ethnicity has probably at least one language, most likely multiple. So the Tusian have 2, maybe 3 languages, Northern Tusian, Southern Tusian, and this other variety, which is either a separate language or a dialect of Southern Tusian. As for the genetic affiliation of the Tusian languages, it's pretty uncertain. Historically, they've been grouped as Gur, but there's been a lot of debate as to what languages, like what language family they belong to. They definitely look like they're Niger-Congo languages. That's one of the main macro families in Africa. But as for further subdivisions, it's kind of uncertain. I personally have worked primarily on Northern Tusian, specifically the variety spoken in Jigbera, but and pretty much everything you see in this talk will come from this variety. So just some preliminary information about Northern Tusian. It's a tonal language. It's got 3 level tones. So you have a difference between high toned yi for year, mid tone yi for laughter, and low toned yi for hair. You also have a number of different contour tones. So the dream has a high mid contour, de versus rock, de. of falling like high-low tone. You also get rising tones, like in the word for poison, ba, which is a low-high tone. And there are some fun tonal minimal pairs, which makes it at times a struggle to work on. So like here we have porridge, ba, limit, ba, poison, ba, and leg, ba. So with that, we can dive into surrogate languages. So broadly, what is a surrogate language? Well, it's an encoding of speech using some non-linguistic method. And all of us use surrogate languages on a daily basis, right? Writing is a type of surrogate language. You also have things like Morse code, but these are really recent inventions. There are also whistled surrogate languages and musical surrogate languages, which has likely been around a lot longer, where you're representing language either by whistling or by playing musical instruments. And then there are kind of further subdivisions as to how like musical surrogate languages and whistled surrogate languages actually do the encoding of, going from language, spoken language to, this other modality. Common ones include representing tone. You also get kind of representing certain aspects of consonants and vowels. Since Tusian is a tonal language, it is a tonal musical surrogate language. And the surrogate language is played on a type of resonating gourd xylophone called a balafone. And it's played by griots, members of a musical caste. I'm going to start off giving some kind of the broader cultural aspects of how this surrogate language is used, and then go in and talk a little bit about the actual kind of linguistic details. So this is a balafone. So a xylophone, you've got all of these different bars. You strike them with these mallets. The bars are made out of a type of hardwood, and each one is tuned. You shave the underside of the bar with an adze, which is kind of like an axe with a horizontal head. And then each bar is paired with a resonating gourd. These gourds are tuned to the same resonant frequency of the bar, and you tune it by like shaving the top of the rim of the gourd. And then to kind of give it a certain timbre that people like, a hole is drilled in the side of the calabash and then covered with something. Historically, they would cover it with like the spider egg sac. But today, most people just cover these holes with a little plastic film. And this gives this kind of distorted buzzing sound, which is really characteristic of a balafone. This is Emil. He's the griot that I work with primarily, and he's an amazing musician. Now, the surrogate languages are often used by griots, and griots are a caste of musicians in West Africa. They have many important cultural roles that vary from ethnicity to ethnicity, but broadly, some of the trends that you see is that griots often keep track of the ancestry of kings, chiefs, other important people. They'll pass down history. They'll tell stories, and they'll lead certain important religious ceremonies. And the griots, being a caste, it's kind of a hereditary position. So, the parents will teach the children how to play musical instruments from a very young age. In the area that I work in southern Burkina Faso, most griots will play either balafons or drums. And this is kind of the case throughout much of, southern Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, in northern Burkina and in Mali. Oftentimes people will play koras, which is a type of, it looks kind of like a guitar. It's played kind of like a harp. It's a really beautiful instrument. And griots will also play drums in northern Burkina and Mali. So griots will play music at a number of different like festivals and ceremonies. They'll play at marriages, funerals, various ceremonies during the planting and harvest season, various festivals. And at each of these events, there's usually a repertoire of songs that only griots are permitted to play. So people who are not born into this griot caste can still learn how to play the balafon, but they're not allowed to fulfill these roles that griots have. So let's just listen to some Tusian music. So we have Emil and his sons, Draman and his son. Now what we just saw was, music. It wasn't necessarily the surrogate language. There might be some surrogate language elements in there, something that I'm not quite sure yet. But the surrogate language, the actual encoding of speech, is used in a number of different contexts that also varies by ethnicity. So griots might use the surrogate language for kind of long distance messaging. There are, historical reports of kind of having, various neighboring villages where they would play certain, they would send certain messages that would basically go out and be transmitted at, the speed of sound from village to village and transmit messages very quickly across like huge distances. But you also get things like, notifying people that ceremonies have begun, letting people know when food is ready. Like the actual surrogate language is used in a number of kind of different contexts. So let's look at what the surrogate language actually looks like and how it functions. Just briefly, if you guys want to learn a lot more, let me know and I'd be happy to explain some stuff or send you some resources. But broadly, what's encoded by the surrogate language is going to be tone, syllable structure, and duration. The syllable structure is kind of optionally encoded. And the way that this kind of works is that the griot will select a frame of 3 adjacent bars and map the tones of speech to those bars. So the lowest pitched bar will be mapped to a low tone, the middle pitched bar to a mid tone, and the highest pitched bar to a high tone. So in this, I've got this diagram, kind of complicated. We can brush over a lot of the details, but basically this is what they're going to be saying. So alembe, and that has a low, mid, high tone. And then what the balafon here is playing on like the different bars goes kind of stepwise up. So low, mid, high.
Alembe, alembe.
So you hear that? Alembe, bum, bum, bum.
Alembe, alembe.
Here's a longer example. This was Emil kind of poking fun at Karim. So you get the Karimu pun swafwo barebam beram bum bum. Now, you might be thinking a couple of different things. Probably the first thing is like, this is so cool. I know that that was my first reaction, at least. But, as you start thinking about this, you might be thinking, wow, this is really ambiguous, right? So we're encoding tone, we're getting some things about like rhythm of speech, but we're not really getting anything about vowel quality. We're not getting most consonantal information, some stuff about syllable structure, but not a lot. Like, how is this enough to actually be able to communicate? Well, there are some really ingenious ways that griots will use to be able to really effectively communicate. One of these is just kind of the nature of when a surrogate language is used. So, the surrogate language will be used at a certain cultural, like events, marriages, funerals, ceremonies, things like that. Odds are you're not going to be talking about the same things at a marriage that you will at a funeral. So that kind of limits the range of topics that would be discussed and kind of prime you to expect certain things to be discussed. There are also, and this is so cool to me, musical surrogate language specific idioms. So these are phrases that are just used on the ballophone and are not used in verbal speech. These are going to be easy to identify and unambiguous. Some of these include like asking somebody to come, saying that food is done, requesting something. And let's go and look at a couple of these idioms. Note that these idioms are a lot longer than what you would say in speech. They've got this built-in redundancy that makes it easier to process, basically more data to analyze. So this is one of these idioms for saying basically, like Bethany or Olivier, come. It's here, instead of saying like Karim Poa or something like what would be in speech, Emil says, Karimu po plo plo mariare. Karim, come, quick, I'm calling you. So you've got a lot of this inbuilt like redundancy. Here is one that I think sounds really beautiful and is pretty interesting in terms of like verbal art. To call somebody for food, it translates into basically like bug is buzzing around because it's hungry. So basically food is ready, it's set out. If you don't eat, like flies are going to start coming. And I just think it sounds so beautiful too. And if you're requesting different like drinks, you would say literally, I said, I want to drink whatever. So we've got here millet beer, we've got like Western beer basically, and wine. Okay. I think I'm out of time, but I'll just wrap up with this. So I just think that surrogate languages are so interesting and they're really important. They're cultural significant in so many different societies, and they're just such beautiful expressions of language. And as linguists, they can be helpful to studying the language as well from a number of different like directions. Personally, I found it really helpful for working with this, just to be able to kind of hear the tones and understand the tonal system of Northern Tusian. But you can also use things like this to kind of probe in on the question of, how are people conceptualizing and representing their language, to themselves and within their community. But yeah, that was it for me. I hope this was interesting, and I hope, new for some people at least.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. Now, if anyone has questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or put a question in the chat, however you'd like to do it.
Okay, I guess I should have a quick question. Colin, I saw you also unmuted. Sorry, I'm going first. I was just wondering how you found out about this and got into this research space, because like this is my first time hearing about this.
Yeah, so well, when I first went to Burkina Faso, I didn't know anything about this, but I was really lucky that Laura McPherson, who's like one of the leaders in studying musical surrogate languages right now, she works in the same region. She actually has written a grammar on Sanku, which is a neighboring language to the Tusian. So she was there at the same time I was there, and then just through kind of discussing these things, I learned about all of this, and I learned about how you might go about studying this. And like as soon as I learned about this, I was like, I need to look into this. This is so fascinating, and I'm so fortunate that I'm working with a community who uses a surrogate language.
Did you have any like prior like musical background or knowledge?
Yeah, so I've played guitar since like 7 and piano since I was 10. But also I'm not too familiar with any of like the musicological or like ethnomusicological stuff, like research. So diving into this has been very novel, and you know.
I had a question if you can hear me.
Yep.
So I was just wondering, is it like, so is it structured that it's 1 note per tone? So I noticed there were like 2 notes for like compound tones.
Yes. So for contour tones, usually you'll play like 2 very quick notes, one after the other. Here, let me pull up the slides. So I call those flams. That's like a percussion term, but usually it's like a very quick one after the other. So like da-dum, and that'll encode a contour tone. Yeah, so real quick. So like here, so with this second word, so poom, it's got a high-low contour tone, and he'll represent it with like a ba-dum. So karimu, ba-de-dum, poom, ba-dum, swa, fwo, bum, bum.
And what I noticed that one of those is a chord. Is it why is it 2 notes at once? Is it like because it's a consonant diphthong, like a labialized consonant, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so this is probably to show phrase boundaries. So there are a couple of different things that they do. So if you have a high or a mid-tone, you'll hit like an octave. If you have a high-low or a low tone, they'll kind of like jump down several notes. So it'll be like this extra low tone. And this is, I think, used to just show basically, okay, the end of this, sentence is here, moving on to a new expression. So it's giving some more of this kind of contextual context of where we might want to parse the beginning and ending of like sentences.
Okay, it's just a terminator. That's cool.
Yep. You do get, so when I said like some aspects of syllable structure are optionally encoded, for consonant clusters and coda consonants, you'll get a double note, so like a flam, that's really quick. So if it's a level tone, if you have a word like wun, which means to leave, you'll hit like but sometimes, not always. These are going to be ambiguous if you have a contour tone and like a coda, or a contour tone and a consonant cluster. So like the word for woman is fle, and it's always going to be represented by like a high mid strike on the ballophone. So you won't ever be able to learn about syllable structure from a contour tone.
And I noticed as well that the encoding redundant information just kind of reminds you of Mandarin, how you have because they have a lot of homophones in Mandarin. So you have like if you just say shi, you don't know what shi can be. So you have like different compound words of shi, like call shi, shi, etc. Something I noticed.
Yeah, that's a cool
Thank you.
observation. I'll have to look into that.
Thanks for answering.
No worries.
I have one more question, but I will let somebody else go first if they want to, since this would be my second. Okay, great. Regarding the surrogate specific idioms, do those sort of basically, like, they follow different grammatical rules in the spoken language, right? So do they have their own like phonology and what would be like grammatically correct in a musical idiom versus, oh, well, like if someone played something as a musical idiom, then someone else would be like, oh, that's not right.
Yeah, so I have noticed some differences between the idioms and spoken speech. I mean, a lot of the times they're just using the actual grammar of the spoken language, just kind of adding in some kind of redundancy or adding in some expressive speech. But I have noticed that in some places the tones are different than what I would expect. So there are some different hypotheses about that. Like Laura McPherson has looked at this with Senku, and she thinks that because these are heavily like idiomatic, that maybe that reflected an earlier form of the language, that these became idioms a couple centuries ago when the tone system might have worked slightly different and the language changed, but these idioms kind of stayed still, and even like the tone was fossilized. So that's one possible thing. You might be able to analyze this in terms of kind of differentiating from speech to keep things as like maximally unambiguous as possible. This is a great question and something that I've thought about and looked into, but I don't have any solid like answers. This is how this works specifically.
So potentially could be like the ancient Indian religious texts that are recited orally, where they represent an older form of the language.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool. Great questions all around, but we need to move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Anthony. Great presentation. Great. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. Matthew, you ready to go?
Yeah. So I have more stuff that I'm going to be able to talk about. So I'm just going to stop whenever I run out of time, if that's okay with everyone.
Totally cool. No
Let's see. All windows. Okay. Great. Can everybody see? Everybody see okay? Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Ket, which is the language that I work on. So Ket is Ket is an indigenous language of Siberia, and it's the last still spoken member of its family that's called Yeniseian, named after the Yenisei River that flows through central Siberia. So the name of the language, Ket in English or Kietsky in Russian, comes from the word Kiet, which means person, or in some cases friend. They actually call their language Ustuin, Kain, Ostyak words, where Ostyak is a name for some groups of native Siberians, or Leitnya Kain, literally our words. And the language, unfortunately, is highly endangered. So it has around 30 fluent speakers remaining, and the youngest of them are in their early 70s. So this is a map of native Siberia. I apologize that it's in Russian. It's the only map I found that I like. So the traditional Ket-speaking areas are this olive-colored blob in the center here. So this is Russia. Here's Moscow. This is Siberia. The traditional Ket-speaking areas are this olive-colored blob. Historically, there were some other related languages that were spoken down here in southern Siberia, but they were replaced. They all ceased to be spoken by the beginning of the 19th century. No, the beginning of the 20th century. We have neighboring languages. So to the east, there are the Evenki people who speak a Tungusic language, so related to Manchu in China. And then to the west, we have Uralic peoples, so distant relatives of Hungarian and Finnish. So we have Nenets, Langasan, sorry, I can't get my cursor moving correctly. Nenets, Langasan, Enets, and Selkup that are all part of the Samoyedic branch of the Uralic languages. And then we have Hunty and Monsky that are Hungarian's closest relatives. And so it is typologically very, very different from all of the languages that surround it. but it's had a lot of interesting influence from neighboring languages that I won't be able to go into detail, but if anyone's interested, shoot me an email and we can talk about it. Ket's big claim to fame is the Diné-Yeniseian hypothesis. So this is a hypothesis that's been fairly well received in the literature. It was proposed by Edward Vida in a paper in 2010, and it postulates that the Yeniseian languages, again, of which Ket is the last still spoken member, are distantly related to the Na-Diné languages of indigenous North America. So the member of this family that you've almost certainly heard of is Navajo down in Arizona and New Mexico, and its sister language Apache. But the family also includes most of the indigenous languages of Alaska and the Yukon. And there's even one Na-Diné language spoken in California, Hupa. So yeah, so this is Ket's big claim to fame, and it's even been picked up by some news outlets who kind of misinterpreted it a little bit. Native Americans and Russians share the same language. Well, no, not exactly, but nonetheless, it's exciting to see it get attention. So, but what I actually work on is the language's complex polysynthetic verbal system. So I wanted to give you guys kind of a sample of what that looks like, and then we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. So we can take a word like Kedongovlan. So we would segment it. It means you guys through us, you second person plural through us. If we segment it, we get this. These three discontinuous pieces are the stem that indicate, that give it the meaning, the throw part of it. These two pieces indicate second person plural subject. This indicates, dung indicates the first person plural object. These two discontinuous pieces represent the past tense. And then this morph of doesn't do anything in this verb. In some other verbs, it does something. So we can compare this with, we can take this, keep this in mind a little bit, and we can compare it with another verb like dabuldangit, which means she carried us. So we would segment it like this. Eat is the stem, so only one piece this time. This indicates a third person feminine subject. This indicates a third person feminine subject again, redundantly. This is a first person plural object, and just this is the past tense. So I'm curious about what's in the chat. Like Arabic and Nahuatl verbs had a baby, very cool. What are some things we can ascertain about Ket just from these two examples? So the things that come to mind for me is it's highly synthetic. There's just a lot of pieces to the verbs. It has polyperson marking, so it indicates both the subject and the object on the verb. Categories are often expressed redundantly. So like we see here with the two different subject markers, this is a phenomenon called multiple exponents, and it's actually fairly common, surprisingly. Categories are often expressed discontinuously. So we saw this with the previous verb, if I can get it to cooperate. We saw this with the previous verb where for example, the past tense is marked redundantly and discontinuously, and the stem is discontinuous, so the meaning parts of the verb are discontinuous. So this is what the whole verbal template looks like. We don't need to go through all of it, but just briefly, there are up to 3 different pieces, like we saw in the one verb, that make up the stem that indicate either lexical or derivational material. There are up to 2 tense markers, which are these 2 slots. And all of these markers, all of these slots in the verb indicate agreement with either the subject or the object. And different verbs use different combinations of them to indicate different arguments. which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. So this leads me into what I do. So I have been doing weekly fieldwork sessions over Skype with Valentina Andreevna Romanenkova. You can see the top of her head here. She always has like the screen like tilted up a little bit, so I can only see like the top of her head. But she's one of the last fluent speakers of Ket, and she she's been working with linguists since at least the early 2000s. So she's a very experienced like linguistic consultant, and we're all extremely lucky to have her. So she and I are putting together a corpus based on our work, which you can look at if you want, ket.ucsd.edu. And in terms of my more theoretically oriented work, I have two main projects. One of them is on a thing called polyfunctionality in Ket, and the other is on the root affix distinction. And I probably will only have time to talk about the one, if that. How am I doing on time?
I think it's been like 7 or 8 minutes, something like that.
Okay, great. So this is an example of a sentence from our corpus. Let's see if I remember to share sound, which I probably didn't. Let's see. Okay.
Так. Ab ios hat selim ulite koge ul abenge kabat toblerak.
So ab ios selim ulite koge ul abenge kabat toblerak. So my house, its roof bad is, it rains when, water to me into the house habitually falls. So what are some things we can say about Ket just based on this sentence? So what's Ket's basic word order? Anybody? Chat. SOV looks like yes, that's right. SOV and postpositions, perfect. And then how does Ket mark possession? Looks like there are both isolating particles and prefixes. Awesome, great job. Yeah, so it's for the first person and also for the second person, there are individual words. Yeah, we can think of as particles, but then there are proclitic, so clicks that get stuck on the beginning of the word for the third person. Right, so it marks possession on the noun as opposed to, I don't know. Okay, great. That's a sample of what Ket looks like and sounds like. So moving into talking about my main project, one of my main projects, polyfunctionality. So Ket verbs have what are called inflection classes that I'm sure you've heard about a few times. Ir and are verbs in Spanish, or like all of the different ways of forming the past tense we have in English, cases where the same information gets encoded differently depending on the word. And what's interesting is that individual markers for verbs use different combinations of different argument markers to mark different arguments. And what's really interesting is that individual Sorry, I think my connection cut off for a second.
Yeah, you're a bit
Was I gone for a
robotic.
second there?
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah,
How
for
is
the
it?
last minute or so before you dropped.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that. I didn't realize it had been that bad. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's
Sure.
okay. We were checking on our side between me and Bethany just to check. Do you want to go back like 1 minute to the, let's see, like beginning of polyfunctionality?
Okay, great. Yeah.
It might help if we turn off our cameras too.
Okay. Great. How is it now? Is it okay?
Yep, it seems all
Oh,
right now.
okay, great.
I'll message you if it starts lagging again.
Thank you. Yeah. So ket verbs have inflection classes, which I'm sure people have heard about if you've taken morphology. So inflection classes are like ir and ar verbs in Spanish, or like all of the different ways that we have of forming the past tense in English. So cases where the same information gets encoded differently depending on the verb. So ket, the way that this works in ket is that, as I noted when we were looking at the template, different verbs use different combinations of different markers to mark different arguments. And what's really interesting is that the same marker, individual markers are polyfunctional across classes. In other words, the same marker can do different things depending on what the verb it occurs in, which verb it occurs in. So we can take, for example, this marker ba or bo, which indicates a first person singular. It can be the object, as in a case like ke bagawa, you throw me, or another one, dabuk saga, she sells me, with double subject marking. It can also indicate the subject, either by itself, as in awering bagara, I spend days, or together with another marker, like in dagabatsak, I make a quick trip to the forest. And it can either indicate an intransitive subject, like in these verbs, or it can indicate a transitive subject, like in dbogbit, in which case there's always two different markers. It's always bo or ba is always together with another marker. There also are cases where the same marker can either mark an argument, a subject or an object, or it can serve some totally different function that's unrelated to argument marking. So o can either indicate a third person masculine argument, subject or object in the past, or it can just be a past tense marker. So we see the first one in a case like donolbit, he had a knife, versus donil dangbit, we had a knife, and so on. And we can see the second in a form like bagowilda, I heard, versus bagavra, agowilda, versus, for example, agowilda, he heard. So we see that o stays, and it changes when the tense changes, but it doesn't change when the person changes. So it's just a past tense marker. It doesn't serve to mark a subject or an object at all. There's also this marker that we ran into briefly. So b or p, depending on the phonological context, can either mark a third person neuter, subject or object, or it can be what's called an empty morph, where it just shows up throughout the paradigm and doesn't add any information to the verb. It's just there. So the first one we can see comparing examples like dus avra, I warm it up, versus dus tarangda, I warm us up, dus karangda, I warm you guys up, and so on. Versus forms like dugdaptang, I pull it on a sled, dungdaptang, I pull us on a sled, kungdaptang, I pull you guys, you plural, on a sled, and so on, where p here just shows up in all forms of the verb and it doesn't seem to add any information. So the question that we run into is, if a speaker of ket encounters a new word that contains a polyfunctional morpheme, so something like ba or o or b, how do they know what it does? How do they know which of its possible functions that particular marker has? And what I've argued in my research is that, among other things, one potential answer is that what other morphemes are present or absent in the verb can tell you a lot about what a morpheme does in that particular instance, in that particular verb. So let's look at an example of this briefly with Barulda, I heard, that we saw before. So Barulda has all three of the markers we talked about. It has ba, it has o, and it has v. So again, ba can be a first-person singular subject or a first-person singular object. O can be a past tense marker or a third-person masculine subject in the past, or a third-person masculine object in the past. And v can be a third-person neuter subject, a third-person neuter object, or an empty morph where it doesn't do anything. And without, like, there's a lot of details that I need to skip over here, but briefly, because we have another person marker that's absent in the verb, a particular person marker that's absent, that tells us that the verb can't be transitive. And that lets us exclude our object marking function from all three of these verbs. From all three of these morphemes. So that reduces it quite a lot. And then we can know that multiple exponents of this, so we can say that, because these two both have multiple functions left over, but this one doesn't. Its only possible function left over is as the subject. So it's our subject. And then there's also a generalization we can make that multiple exponents, so marking the subject in this case, or the object twice, is only possible with this one marker that's absent. So because it's absent, we can say that we can't have multiple exponents with ba. We can't have another marker also indicating the subject with ba. And so we can exclude our subject marking function from o and from v. And we can conclude that o is a past tense marker and v is an empty morph. And so we have a fully disambiguated verb based on these verb internal generalizations we can make, even though on their own, three of the markers are ambiguous with regard to their function. So I'm going to stop here. If anyone's interested in the question part, we can talk about the root affix distinction. I'm sure I'm over time, but I'm going to stop here.
All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and jump into the question section. Great job, Matthew.
So for the empty morphs, I was wondering if you had any idea, like, where they came from or why they're there. Is it phonological? Did they used to have meaning?
It's so not my work, but some work that Edward Vida's done. His 2010 paper that I mentioned includes a really interesting reconstruction of some of the history of the ket verb. And his hypothesis is that what he's shown by comparison with some other languages that were related to ket that are no longer spoken is that it came from metathesis, from like switching around of elements from other parts of the verb. So we have this discontinuous stem, and we had either a thing at the meaning part that comes at the very end, starting with a B, or we had a meaning part to the left that was a B or a P, and they got switched around, so they ended up in the same slot as the actual third-person neuter argument marker B. And because they were homophonous, they got reanalyzed as sort of having the same distribution as this neuter marker, neuter subject or object marker. In fact, speakers actually will confuse them sometimes. So they'll take a verb that has an empty morph and then suddenly start treating it like it's an object marker, and swapping it out for other object markers. But they don't do this with every verb. So yeah, that's the story, is metathesis with reanalysis from other parts of the verb.
Yeah, I find the discontinuous stem to be so cool. I don't know if I've ever seen like anything like that before. Is that so? So far as the argument or hypothesis that there's a larger language family of Dene and SCN, what type of evidence is that based off of? Is it largely vocabulary? Probably not morphology. I don't know. What is it?
Oh, actually, mostly on morphology. So that even if they're not related, so there are sound correspondences. There's like that have been proposed, and there are cognates that have been proposed. So for example, the Dene is the word for people in most of the non-Dene languages, and the Athabascan languages specifically, which is a branch of the family. And the word for people in Ket is Dien. And it's been proposed that these are related. There's others, like the word for liver, the word for a couple of other like pieces of basic vocabulary. But a lot of it comes from historical reconstruction of the verb. So what historically happened, let me go back to the slides really quick. Yeah. So historically what happened is that this part at the end, so the P1 here that I have labeled as base, that's the original verb root. And this part, P0 through P4, are basically the original verb. And both Ket and the non-Dene languages are head final and prefixing, historically prefixing. So basically you have either the object of the verb or a postpositional phrase, sorry, that comes immediately before the verb. And what happened is it got reanalyzed as a set of prefixes on the verb. And so you just have stuff continuously globbed onto the left edge of the verb. And that's exactly what happened in non-Dene languages too. So if you look at this basic sort of, if you kind of peel back the layers and try to get a sense of what the verb was originally like, they're actually remarkably similar. They even have some weird quirks, like the animate third person is marked further to the left in a different position class slot than an inanimate argument. So stuff like that has interesting parallels in non-Dene. So even if they're not actually related, I think there's a lot that can be gained from the study, a lot that can be gained in studying one of the families by studying the other family.
All right, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Just real quick, I was wondering what's the name of the, I think you said 2010 paper that...
I can pull it up, but it's a Siberian link with today. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Yeah, let's see, where do I have the cat literature?
Sorry to make you search through all your files.
No, it's easy to, no, thank you for being interested. I really, really love this paper. So I'm like really happy to like share it with, I'm really happy to be sharing it with someone. Let's see, literature, I didn't fill this stuff. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. And it also talks about some of the proposed sound correspondences. So Yes, okay, great.
I actually had a question for both of you, Anthony and Matt. I guess in a more broad question would be, what made you guys decide that you were interested in fieldwork research? Was it because you encountered a specific language, or you kind of already knew that you wanted to do something with fieldwork, you just didn't know what yet? Just for students who might be interested in pursuing that side of linguistics, I guess.
Do you want to start, Anthony? Or?
Sure. So there was one professor at my undergrad who's done a ton of documentation, and went to a really interesting talk of his where he had collaborated with a Sudanese geneticist and was looking at kind of both linguistic and genetic data of the Dogon families. Just kind of had the opportunity to talk with him, and kind of, you know, the opportunity fell in my lap. But yeah, I'd say, like, when it comes to doing research, in general, no matter what type of research you want to do, the first step is always going to be like talking with professors and expressing your interest, and you know, they might be able to give you some really great opportunities.
Okay.
And then in my case, I guess I started with actually as a Russian major in undergrad. And so I have always been really interested, as I know Anthony is too, in language learning, and in anthropology, and in sort of in the cultural side of things, not just the linguistic side of things. And I know I didn't want to be an armchair linguist who does word math, right? I wanted to be someone who actually gets to study, actually learn the language, who gets to actually go out and experience the language in a cultural context, and who sort of gets the, you know, sees the human side of everything. And so that's a thing that's been really important to me. In my case, I actually like decided I wanted to work on CAT specifically, and like contacted the major scholars who have already worked on it, and eventually found my way to a speaker. So that's also, if opportunities don't fall in your lap, you also can create them. Like, people are amazingly responsive to, hey, I'm such and such, and I want to learn about this topic that you love and have spent your whole career working on. People are amazingly responsive to that. So.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I actually had like an extra question. I know we don't have much time, but I guess I know that some of your elicitations or work with your speakers have been remote. Do you guys know if you have any plans with whatever you're working on now to actually go back and meet up with speakers to do work, or has it been very remote as of right now?
Yeah, I'll be heading back to Burkina this summer. So I'll be there for about a month and a half in the summer.
Awesome.
And I was supposed to be there right now. I got a fellowship to like go in, and then, so first COVID happened, and then Ukraine happened. And so I probably won't be able to go back to Russia for, well, a couple years at least. So my work has been entirely remote, but at the same time, I think it's good that a silver lining that's come out of COVID is that there's been more acceptance of remote work in the field, which has a lot of, you know, it doesn't replace in situ field work, but it has a lot of advantages in terms of accessibility and cost and equity, and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And now I guess if there's no further questions, before we end today's event, we'd also like to share some resources if you want more information how to get involved with field research that's happening at UCSD. So I will share my screen with you guys, just for those who may watch this recording later and want the information that's shared in the chat. So here we have all the links, and this was actually very graciously given to me by Professor Caballero, who is not able to be here today. But yeah, if you guys are interested in fieldwork research, let me just 1 second. Actually, I I need to stop sharing for a second because I have to get the links. My bad. Let me, 1 second, copy that down and then send it into the chat. So there you go, all the emails. And then also if you want to get in contact with professors who are doing like a linguistics fieldwork working group right now, you can contact Professor Rose, Professor Clem, Professor Yuan, and also Professor Caballero. And let me share the screen again one more time. But yeah, thank you so much for coming today. And thank you to Matt and Anthony for presenting.
Thank you guys for having us.